Hello everyone, welcome to the game of the day for the chess24 Legends of Chess. Today we had the final day of the final between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. I picked the first game that they played today, the game where Magnus had the white pieces, Jan had the black pieces. I thought it was the game that kind of set the tone for the match. In both of the decisive games today, one player was winning after about 20 moves, and so it was hard to decide which one. The other one was a Sicilian. It had some interesting moments as well, but this one I thought was just so unusual in terms of the opening that I decided to go for this one. So it starts with d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6. So Jan plays either the King's Indian or the Grunfeld here, and Magnus goes for bishop f4. After the game, he was asked how he had prepared for this match, and he said he had prepared to play some sharper lines, but then ultimately decided to go for the London system, which is something that, of course, he's got a lot of experience with, but he, so I don't know why he decided not to go for the sharper lines, go for this. It was sort of a spur of the moment thing, it sounded. So Jan plays bishop g7, e3, castles. It always seems like the King's Indian setup against the London system is not a bad setup, because Black ultimately has a plan of playing e5, which does seem to counter fairly well the black bishop on f4. That being said, as always, it's about concrete analysis and not just generalities to figure out whether this is good or bad. But in general, this setup for black is not a bad one versus the London system. So Jan plays d6, castles, and now he goes for knight h5, which is one of the moves. Jan himself has played the move c5 a lot here. He's got several games with that. There's also an older plan playing knight d7, where you get play like this. You usually play b6. Now against b6 especially, white tends to play c4, not c3, to kind of prepare to sometimes block that bishop up with d5. But play can go like c4, bishop b7, knight c3, rook e8, black prepares to play e5, and we have a complicated game. But in this game, Jan decides to go after the bishop with knight h5. And that's a pretty sharp way to play this position. Bishop g5, h6. It's kind of the idea of knight h5 that white has not had time to play h3 to be able to put that bishop back on h2. So he plays h6, bishop h4, and g5. Now white responds with a typical move here. Instead of playing bishop g3, which allows that bishop to be captured sort of at will by the knight, he plays knight f to d2. And so this asks black kind of a tough question. Do you want to return with knight f6, forcing the bishop back to g3? But then you won't get the bishop pair. Or do you want to take on h4, bishop takes h5, and then the pawn structure has kind of been ruined. We have doubled pawns here. Both are possible. I saw some interesting games here that went like e5, c3, f5. It's very sharp. In the long term, white's got to try to exploit the weaknesses of the pawns, but black has two bishops and a very active play. But in this game, Jan returns with knight f6, bishop g3, and then he plays knight c6. Now Magnus plays a pretty pretty surprising move, in my opinion. Especially in the London system, you're kind of used to seeing white plays c3. Here, Magnus plays knight c3. There is logic to this. One of the things is that because he's got the other knight on d2, and he doesn't necessarily want to return to f3 because that would allow knight h5, right? And so he doesn't necessarily have a good square for this knight just yet. So in that regard, he's like, you know what, I'm developing my piece to the most natural square. And if given the opportunity, right now he's got to watch for the d4 pawn, but it could support e4, and it's not a bad square for the knight in and of itself. So, but typically in these Queen's Gambit positions, we're so used to seeing the pawn first come to c4 that knight c3 makes kind of an odd impression. So black plays e5, very natural move. Magnus captures on e5, which makes sense here because he doesn't have the ability to support the center, right? So it makes sense to take. And now knight takes e5. Pawn takes e5 just doesn't seem right, having weakened the light squares like this. White can either play bishop f3, maybe bishop c4, even knight c4 is possible, and then just try to play on the light squares, possibly with e4 at some point. Looks like white should be a little bit better in these positions. So knight takes e5 is very sensible. But now Magnus makes kind of a shocking move. He plays f4. And this wouldn't be so shocking if not for the next move that he's forced to play. Because, so f4 in and of itself, like the knight was back on f6, on c6, for example, would be positionally seem like a reasonable move. Try to open up the f file, maybe weaken up the black king side. But here, after knight g4, which is a natural response, he kind of has to play the move rook f3 because knight c4 will probably get hit with d5 at some point, which should be unpleasant. So he's forced to play rook f3, and that's a move that is kind of odd, right? It just looks like the rook is such a strange piece here. But Magnus, I don't know, I don't think this was preparation. I think this is just kind of spur of the moment stuff. But he seems to have, a plan of playing knight f1 and h3, try to kick this knight off, and the position doesn't look bad for white. It gets very complicated though. So black plays rook e8, knight f1 has to defend the pawn. And now Jan plays knight h5, and knight h5 looks like a very reasonable move. He's attacking the bishop. White's plan is clearly to play h3, which can embarrass this knight. It turns out that of all the knight moves that he can make, knight h5 is the worst one. And oddly enough, either knight d7 or knight h7 were both a little bit better. And it's really just for kind of tactical reasons. Knight h7 is the one that I looked at a little bit more, and the idea is that if white plays h3, he goes back to f6, and the knight on h7 actually does serve a purpose, which is that on pawn takes g5, the knight jumps very happily to g5 with a pretty decent position. So that's the idea, and white doesn't have to play h3 right away. They can make a move like bishop d3 or even e4 or queen d2. Different possibilities. It's still going to be a really complicated game, but at least this knight can now come back. And on most moves, it might just come back next move no matter what. And yeah, just complicated. The knight from there can maybe come to h5 as well. Now let's see what's wrong with what happened in the game. So he goes knight h5. Magnus plays bishop e1. So a simple move, really, just getting out of the attack. And suddenly these knights are just kind of awkward. And h3 is still a threat. So if he plays, like, let's say he makes just kind of a waiting move like c6, then h3 is really strong. The knight comes back to f6, and this knight on h5 is actually getting trapped. So you can play like rook f2, either take on g5 first and rook f2, and now this threat is essentially unstoppable. So white is just winning. So that's kind of the problem with knight h5. And there was a move here that leads to really complicated positions that is worth looking at. And that's g takes f4. So after g takes f4, e takes f4, and then queen e7. And so this gets really messy. And there's another move too, queen f6, which we'll look at after. But let's look at queen e7, which creates the somewhat primitive threat of giving the bishop up for the knight and then taking on e2. But now white, through some crazy tactics, actually gets an advantage. But this variation is almost impossible to see in a real game. So the variation starts with h3. Now if black just returns, their position is pretty bad here. We'll play rook e3. It's actually more than pretty bad. It just loses everything. So he's got to go for the crazy variation with bishop takes c3, white takes on c3, queen takes bishop. Now the only move that leads to a good position for white, so queen takes e2 wouldn't work because this is just better for black. So he's got to go for it here and play queen to d4, threatening mate on h8. So black goes back to f6. Now knight g3. So it creates sort of a double threat here. Now knight takes g3 is no good because either queen takes f6 or rook takes g3 check first. So he's got to play c5. So this is a counter-attacking move, and this is obviously a computer variation, one that's really hard. Tough move to see. And now only one move keeps the advantage for white, and that's queen takes d6. Queen e6, trying to defend everything up. And now again, only one move for white to keep the advantage. And this one is probably the toughest one of all of them. Rook d1. And somehow these knights are really bad on h5 and f6. And black doesn't have a good way to play here. They can make all kinds of moves. Like one of the moves that the computer gives is b5, trying to develop the bishop. And white is still better because these knights are just in a tough spot. I also looked at on rook d1 taking the queen, and after rook takes, somehow there's just no defense to this knight on f6. So crazy position here. White is still better. So yeah, it's already not an easy position after bishop e1 here. Surprisingly enough, in the game. Oh, I said I was going to look at. There was one more move I said I was going to look at, and that was queen to f6 here. Instead of queen e7, with the idea of giving maybe an obnoxious check. But white actually has a good move here, just king h1, sort of stopping a check, threatening h3 because that knight doesn't have squares. And then on queen d4, white has to move rook to d3, which does seem to keep a pretty decent edge for white here. So in the game, what does Jan do? Well, Jan plays f5. So with the idea that, on h3, he can return to f6. And now he's got the possibility of playing g4. So there's no rook f2 because g4. There is rook f2, but g4 will be a reasonable response. So, but however, there's a big problem with f5. If you have a second, stop the video to try to see what the problem is with this move. The response here for white is bishop c4 check. And amazingly enough, this almost ends the game right there. The problem is that if the king moves, so let's say king h7 or king h8, then bishop f7 does a little skewer here, and black is losing material, right? And in a pretty bad way, because here, even h3 will come next. It's just a very bad position. So that's number one. And then the second problem is that on bishop e6, which is what he plays in the game, white takes on e6, rook takes e6, plays h3, forcing the knight to come back. Then he takes on g5. So all of this is sort of forced. Pawn takes g5, and then the pawn on f5 hangs. And it is a bad pawn to lose because, first of all, the pawn on g5 is still weak, so black's king will never feel very safe. And also just this knight arrangement is really less than optimal. So the rest of the game is just very nice technique from white. Bishop h6 was played. White played g4. The knight is forced to g7, a terrible square. The bishop on h6 is also not very good, right? Being blocked by the knight on g7. Rook f3. Black plays queen d7. So now it's just black is trying to survive and potentially get counterplayed down the road. Magnus plays knight g3, eyeing those nice squares. Black plays rook e8. Bishop f2. Nice move. The idea of bishop f2 is that the bishop is probably the worst piece. He's preparing here to probably play e4 and bishop d4, which is bringing the bishop from a square that wasn't very good on e1 to a really good square on d4. And often this is the way to play positions where you have a big advantage, is try to keep things stable, but gradually take every piece and say, what's the best square that this piece can get to, and try to achieve it. Now Jan plays queen c6, an attempt at creating some sort of counterplay against a rook, but it doesn't help the position much because after e4, Magnus's threat of playing bishop d4 becomes really, really strong. He played knight d7, and now knight d5 is really a good move, threatening rook c3, threatening bishop d4, and the position is just not tenable for black. So Jan resigned this position kind of it looks like an early resignation, but in reality it's really not, because things are just falling apart for black. The threat of rook c3 is very hard to deal with, followed by knight takes c7. So really it was a great start of the day for Magnus, and after that Magnus was able to take the match by winning the second game and drawing the third game. So probably at least for me, I know Magnus said he thought he maybe played better in the Chessable Masters. I thought he was really impressive in this tournament. Maybe yesterday being sort of a day where he didn't play quite as well, but today very impressive, and the matches against Vidler also were very impressive. So pretty dominant performance from Magnus. We'll see how Ding Liren can do against him in the semifinal. Ding Liren is someone who has in the past done quite all right versus Magnus, and so we'll see if he's able to rebound from the performance in this Legends of Chess event to give him a tough go at it in the final, which will start reasonably soon, in just a few days really. So with that said, thanks for joining me for all these games of the day. I hope you enjoyed them and took a thing or two from it, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you.